Pole position. The best starting position possible for a Grand Prix. Secured by setting the fastest lap the day before by being near perfect through every corner. You get to start in the lead, nobody between you and those 5 red lights. The position where 493 of the 1,141 Formula 1 races have been won. 43% of every race won from pole. What could possibly go wrong? Well, that's what this video is all about. Trying to find the worst pole position ever. Now, I'm not talking about the actual pole lap itself, because even a bad pole lap, whatever that might be, is still the fastest lap of that day. I instead want to find the worst use of pole. A race where the driver starts first and just makes mistake after mistake after mistake and just falls further and further down the order before finishing in a low position. Now, an obvious place to start would be the races where they got pole but didn't start the race. This has happened 5 times in Formula 1 history, the first time being the Argentinian Grand Prix of 1975. Jean-Pierre Jarier got his first pole position, but had a transmission failure on the formation lap. At the 1982 German Grand Prix, Didier Pironi took pole, then went on to have his crash that would break both of his legs and never return to the sport. At the 1996 French Grand Prix, Michael Schumacher got pole, but his engine would fail on the formation lap. Jarno Trulli would possibly have the most controversial of these at the 2005 United States Grand Prix, where he got pole but would retire from the race before the formation lap, along with 14 other drivers after the Michelin tyres were not safe to use and a compromise could not be met between Michelin and the FIA, in a story which is far too big to go into depth right now. Then the most recent example of this would be Charles Leclerc in Monaco in 2021. After securing pole for the first time at his home race, he crashed, which ended qualifying and gave him pole position. This damage meant that he would not start the race after Ferrari chose to risk it, not wanting to get an engine penalty. I could also go for a race like the 1993 Hungarian Grand Prix, where Alain Prost took pole but then stalled on the grid and then had to start the race from the back. Or a race like the 2002 Australian Grand Prix, where Rubens Barrichello started from pole, but his race was ended before the first corner. But what I really want isn't a race where a mechanical failure costs them a chance, or a little mistake at the start costs them a chance, but just constant mistakes. Just a downright awful race. So, to start my search, I got a list of every single pole position ever that did not result in a race win, and sorted them from lowest position to highest position, and took out any did not finish, because I want a race where the driver actually crosses the finish line. And that's where I found drives like the 1990 French Grand Prix, where Nigel Mansell started from pole position, but he would retire with an engine failure, but because it was on lap 72 of 80, it was still classified as it counted as an 18th place finish. This would happen a lot in this search, such as the 1974 South African Grand Prix, where Niki Lauda started on pole, and he was second until the 74th of 78 laps, where he would suffer an ignition failure and was out of the race, but still classified 16th. I then came across the 2021 Mexican Grand Prix, which as of recording is Valtteri Bottas' final pole position, but who knows how the Cadillac car may go in the future. But again with this, Bottas is tapped by Ricciardo going into turn 1, spins and falls down the order. He would climb up to be just outside the points, but then had a late pit stop to deny Max Verstappen getting the fastest lap point, back when that was an acceptable thing to do before it happened to Lando Norris in Singapore last year and it became a really bad and evil thing to do. Bottas would finish 15th in that race, so again I don't think this can count as the worst, as it was a turn 1 incident that wasn't his fault, followed by a late pit stop, so the search continues. This brings us back to Nigel Mansell, who started on pole for the 1987 Hungarian Grand Prix and was leading until his front right wheel nut came loose and he had to retire from the race on the 70th of 76 laps. so again, I'm not counting this. And so far, all I was learning is that this quest was going to be incredibly difficult, and Nigel Mansell is very unlucky. Next I came across 3 different drivers who had all converted pole position into 14th place. Firstly, Jean-Pierre Jabouille at the 1979 Italian Grand Prix, but again this was an engine failure on the 45th of 50 laps whilst running 4th. Then we go to Belgium 2005 and Juan Pablo Montoya, but again he didn't actually finish the race and wasn't at fault for his retirement as he was hit by a Williams car that was trying to unlap himself on dry tyres. Then finally it was the 2014 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Nico Rosberg started on pole for this, and it was the final race of the year with the world title on the line. Rosberg trailed Hamilton by 17 points, but for the first and hopefully only time in Formula 1, there were double points available for the final race of the year. Hamilton would take the lead immediately, and he would slowly move further and further away. It was revealed that Rosberg had an ERS failure, and he would lose a position to Massa in the Williams. Then through pit stops he would lose positions to Bottas and Ricciardo, and then Nico Hülkenberg would overtake him on track. Rosberg was told to retire the car as they had too many issues, but he refused. Hamilton won the race and the title, and Rosberg fell down to 14th. But again, not much Rosberg could really do here, so I don't think this should count. So let's move on to whatever's next on the list. Let's see, what is it? Oh God. For the Singapore Grand Prix of 2008, Felipe Massa started on pole position, and he would lead the race until Nelson Piquet Jr. would crash on purpose. This brought out the safety car. When the pit lane opened, Massa pit from the lead for tyres and to refuel, and the light would go green for him to leave the pit box, but the fuel hose was still attached. Normally this would be automated, but as the pit lane was so busy due to everyone pitting under safety car, they had to do it manually and there was a mistake. Massa would eventually fight back to finish in 14th place, but this would be even more painful as Massa scored nothing in that race, whilst Lewis Hamilton finished 3rd and scored 6 points. Hamilton would then go on to beat Massa for the world title by just 1 point. But if ERS and engine failures get you counted out of this competition, I also think one of the biggest cheating scandals in the history of the sport should also count you out. So we continue, this time to the 1974 Argentinian Grand Prix, where we find Ronnie Peterson, who started from pole and would finish 14th, and was lapped not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but 5 times. Which you would think, wow, that surely gets you in this competition, but again, this was a car issue. Peterson was suffering from brake failure from the early laps in the race, and he really should have just retired. I was beginning to think at this point that maybe there was no such thing as a bad race from pole position. Maybe if you are a driver talented enough to put the fastest lap on Saturday, maybe you just don't have bad drives. Everywhere I looked, there was a justifiable reason for why the race had gone so wrong. Prost at the 1993 Italian Grand Prix had an engine failure on the 49th lap whilst leading the race. Piquet in the 1981 Brazilian Grand Prix, the Brabham team start Piquet on dry tyres despite the fact that they were on a wet track, and it sees him fall to 15th place before the end of the first lap, and he would come back to finish in 12th. Lewis Hamilton at the 2009 Italian Grand Prix is currently a contender, and possibly the best contender we have, because he was in 2nd until he crashed by himself on the penultimate lap of the race. But again, I'm looking for a race where the driver actually finished. Lewis Hamilton again at the 2008 Grand Prix, where he undoubtedly had an awful start, but then was just hit by Felipe Massa and completely fell down the order and would fight back to 12th. Ronnie Peterson finished 11th from pole after a gearbox failure at the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. Emerson Fittipaldi had a fuel line failure whilst leading the 1973 Austrian Grand Prix. Ayrton Senna is sandwiched at the 1989 Brazilian Grand Prix and falls back, then fights to 11th. Senna again is hit by a lapped Williams at the 1988 Italian Grand Prix to fall to 10th. Jenson Button has an engine failure whilst 5th at the 2006 Australian Grand Prix. Jim Clark has a fuel pump failure, seeing him finish 10th for the 1965 Italian Grand Prix whilst running 3rd. It seemed the quest was over. There had never been a bad race from any driver starting from pole, which could not be explained by things external to them. It was time to call it a day. But then I hit an absolute gold mine. So I have found for you not just one bad pole position conversion, but in fact I have found 5. Here are your nominations for the worst uses of pole position in Formula 1 history. Carlos Reutemann, Caesars Palace Grand Prix 1981. Going into the final race of 1981, Carlos Reutemann led the championship by 1 point from Nelson Piquet. Reutemann had claimed pole with his title rival down in 4th, in a race that would be made famous by being featured in the Stop and Go F1 Retro Review of 1981, which you can watch right now. I'll leave a link in the description, but if I forget to do that, there's a playlist somewhere on the channel. You should watch it. You should definitely watch it. Not enough people watched it. Reutemann had a dreadful start, losing places to his teammates, who had publicly stated before the race that he would not obey team orders to help Reutemann win the title, after Reutemann had ignored team orders earlier in the season. Reutemann also lost places to Villeneuve, Prost and Bruno Giacomelli to put him in 5th, but the good news for him was that Piquet had had an equally bad start and was down in 8th. After the first lap, Reutemann would continue to fall backwards, and by lap 17 he found himself just in front of Piquet in 7th. Piquet would get past him, as well as Mario Andretti, who snuck past. But as long as Piquet was not in the top 6, he wouldn't score any points, and Reutemann would be champion. 4 laps later, Piquet was in the points, and Reutemann was still struggling. He would fight back slightly, but by this point it was far too late. Piquet finished 5th and Reutemann finished 8th outside the points, and he lost the world title in the final race of the year by just 1 point. And to truly rub it in, Reutemann was lapped by his teammate Alan Jones, who went on to win the race. Jarno Trulli, Belgium 2004. This was Jarno Trulli's 3rd year with the Renault team, and after being convincingly beaten by his teammate Fernando Alonso in 2003, Trulli was now leading the Renault team in the championship going into this race. Trulli had gotten pole earlier in the year at Monaco and converted that into his first ever win, and he got pole at Spa, beating Michael Schumacher by just 0.072 of a second, but was nearly half a second faster than Alonso in 3rd. Trulli would get away well and led the race. He would come into pit on lap 9 for tyres and for fuel, and after the pit stops he would be easily passed by Michael Schumacher, and then when Juan Pablo Montoya dived down the inside, Jarno Trulli shut the door on him and they collided, with Trulli falling down to 8th, and then further down to 12th, although thanks to retirements from the likes of Button, Montoya and Zonta, Trulli finished up in 9th place. 2 races later, he would be fired from Renault, and his Monaco win would be the only one of his career, whilst Fernando Alonso would go on to win the next 2 World Championships with Renault. Nico Rosberg, Bahrain 2013. This was the 2nd pole position of Rosberg's career. He had turned his maiden pole into his maiden win the previous year in China, but that would not be the case today. It had been a pretty convincing pole position, 0.254 faster than Vettel in 2nd, and nearly half a second faster than his new teammate Lewis Hamilton in 4th, who Rosberg trailed by 28 points in the championship after only 3 races. Rosberg would keep the lead at the start, until the 3rd lap of the race, when Vettel would get past for the lead and Alonso would follow through as well, as would Paul di Resta in the Force India. Rosberg was given a slight lifeline due to Alonso's DRS being stuck open and forcing him to pit to fix it twice, giving Rosberg back 3rd. But after pit stops, he would find himself behind not only Vettel and di Resta, but now Raikkonen, Webber, Button and Perez, with Rosberg sitting in 7th. He would then be passed by Grosjean and Lewis Hamilton, and after another pit stop, a recovering Alonso would be back in front of Rosberg, and Rosberg would finish the race in 9th place, 41 seconds off the lead. Lewis Hamilton, the German Grand Prix 2019. Lewis Hamilton has more pole positions than anyone in the history of the sport, and has turned 58% of them into wins, but this is one he'll probably want to forget. Mercedes was celebrating 125 years of competing in motorsports and their 200th F1 start, meaning they had a special livery at their home race. Hamilton got pole convincingly 3/10 faster than the Red Bull of Max Verstappen in second place, and he would get away well, comfortably leading the race. And nearing the halfway point, Hamilton was leading by 35 seconds, but he would go off the track and hit the wall, and when he returned back into the race, he would cut across the grass to get into the pit lane and come back out in 5th. He would then get a 5-second time penalty for passing the wrong side of the pit entrance, and he would work back to 2nd, but made the call to come into pit for the slicks a lap too late. And then when he actually pitted himself, he also had to serve his penalty and would return back onto the track in 12th place. He would then fall to 14th and then to 15th. A crash from Valtteri Bottas promoted Hamilton back to 14th, then overtakes on the Williams cars and a collision from Gasly in the final laps got Hamilton back to 11th, where he would finish. Although 30-second penalties for Raikkonen and Giovinazzi after the race promoted Hamilton back to the points, giving him a final finishing position of 9th. Lance Stroll, Istanbul 2020. Lance Stroll's only pole position so far in his career might be one of the most impressive pole positions of all time. Stroll set a lap at the 2020 Turkish Grand Prix, which was nearly 3/10 faster than Max Verstappen in second, and a huge 4.7 seconds faster than Lewis Hamilton. On the same weekend, he would become a 7-time world champion. In the race itself, it was still very wet, and after one of the slowest getaways in F1 history, Stroll led a race for the first time in his career, with his teammate Sergio Perez in second. And while others struggled, Stroll would continue to lead. He would then pit on lap 37 for new inters for the second time, whilst others stayed out, and this was when his race started to fall apart, as he would lose places to both Ferraris, Vettel and Leclerc. A couple laps later, Albon was past Stroll, and then Sainz was past Stroll. With 15 laps to go, Lance was 8th, with an 18-second lead on Ricciardo in 9th, and a 24-second lead on Norris in 10th. But with 2 laps to go, Stroll had been caught by Norris and went off the track, where Lando would get past. Ultimately, Lance Stroll finished 9th, 1 minute and 12 seconds behind race winner Lewis Hamilton, with Stroll's teammate Sergio Perez finishing in 2nd place. So there you have it. That is my choices for the worst pole positions ever. But which do you think is the worst? Cast your votes by letting me know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.